In the midst of preparing for a college football playoff game against Texas, of course, Kalen DeBoer and staff are also trying to round up a collection of players that can compete for Big Ten championships and playoff appearances in the future. We're going to break down the 2024 Washington class with Lars Hansen. You can catch him on a Locked On Huskies podcast, also UW Fan Nation. Lars, what's going on tonight?
Oh, it's always a great early Christmas when there's National Signing Day. So I'm always happy to be on with you, Mark.
Absolutely. Appreciate you jumping on board. We've got a class that, according to 247 Sports, is number 29 in terms of an overall rank. And there, of course, is then the transfer portal. We've got 15 that have signed letters of intent. 16 should be the final number, at least during this 2-day span. Your thoughts about the class overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty well-rounded class for the most part. This was always going to be a smaller class for Washington, both because of the number of seniors graduating and just the way the kind of roster had been built. It's pretty backlogged. So next year is expected to be a more traditional 2025 plus class. But Washington pretty much got everything they needed with this class. The only position they didn't get was running back, and that's the one position on the roster that they're completely full at. So there wasn't really any missing pieces. I mean, obviously, Dominic Kirks is the only, as you mentioned, the only commitment that hasn't put in a national letter of intent. But I think even with or without that addition, whether he chooses to actually sign with Washington or ends up somewhere else, I think even the bodies that they had at edge with Noah Carter and Keona Wilhite, they're more than serviceable, and I think that'll kind of alleviate that potential loss. And then you also have transfers coming in and things like that. So I think overall the class, it's not necessarily going to be a star-studded class, but I do think there's going to be a significant amount of starters in probably two plus years from now.
Folks, when you're doing your last-minute Christmas shopping, use the Amazon link that we provide in the description section of the video. Grab that link. It's the same shopping experience. Doesn't cost you a penny. Lars Hansen here to break down the Huskies' National Signing Day. And when we look at this class, the obvious thing to do would be to go to the top and run down all the players, but not necessarily that being the case in regards to the star value. Who are you excited to see, and who do you think could make a major impact when it's all said and done?
So I do think the guy at the top of the list on the screen, Noah Carter, the four-star edge rusher from Centennial High School in Peoria, Arizona, I do think has the chance to be one of the higher ceiling guys in this class. But as you go down the list, the one that really intrigues me the most, there's two, and they're both at safety. Joshua Lair from Missouri City, Texas, and Peyton Waters from Van Nuys, California. He's Birmingham High School is where he's at. One of them, Joshua Lair, is a true safety, but 6'1", 6'2", 180. Peyton Waters is a guy who could kind of play a number of different positions. I mean, played receiver, played kick returner, and a number of different positions at Washington, or not at Washington, at Birmingham High School. And I think that's what really attracted the coaching staff to him, was his ability to play a number of different positions. And I think that's kind of the way that this defense has kind of been structured by Chuck Morrell and William Inns, the co-defensive coordinators, to where you need to be able to play a multitude of positions and if you want to truly see the field. And those two right off the bat, Washington also got, as we're seeing on the screen, former Duke commit Paul Menke Jr., son of former Washington State quarterback Paul Menke. That one was it wasn't necessarily a surprise because Washington had really been slowly pushing for him. But that only kind of happened because Washington lost a player in the transfer portal at safety in Vince Nunley. And it kind of seemed like the coaching staff was planning on that being a fallback option. And Menke, I mean, the coaches really like him. He's kind of a true center fielder, a guy that can be a playmaker, read defenses. He's not the hardest hitter. I would kind of defer Josh Laird to being the hardest hitter in the secondary in this class. But I do think all three of those safeties are going to make an impact for Washington in the years to come.
Yeah, from the standpoint of where Washington's going for players, and Kalen DeBoer obviously going now through what is, in a sense, his third recruiting cycle. Chris Peterson before that, Jimmy Lake, the quick stay for one season, basically. Is it pretty much in line with what Washington's done in the past, or is Kalen DeBoer going a different direction, whether that be geographically or otherwise?
No, for the most part, this staff, I mean, Kalen DeBoer has basically been adamant that Washington's going to get the bulk of their players from the state of California and potentially a handful in Texas, and that's exactly what they did. The only one that hasn't signed that I mentioned, Dominic Kirks out of Ohio, that one was kind of the out of left field, hey, we're going to try and see if we can develop these relationships on the more Midwest, East Coast part of the country. And I just never got the sense from Kirks that he was truly committed to Washington because he had taken official visits to Ohio State, Michigan State, and a number of other programs. But there was no schools of that mix that were also offering him. I mean, Michigan State did offer, I believe, in September, but it kind of seemed like, okay, well, this is like a fallback option. And so I think for the most part, to answer your question, Kalen DeBoer is going to build his roster between California and the Midwest because that's where most of the staff has recruiting ties. There's, you have Anoke Brechterfield who spent some Midwest ties, Chuck Morrell, William Inge, Midwest ties. So I think that pretty much there's nothing out of the ordinary with this class. The one thing to your point that is interesting, and Kalen DeBoer touched on it during his press conference on Wednesday, where he was asked, you guys didn't sign any of these prospects in the state of Washington. And although that has been kind of a gripe amongst fans, hey, how come you're letting, Braden Platt go to Oregon or Jason Brown Jr. go to Arizona State? Well, Washington was already pretty full at both edge and linebacker when Braden Platt made his decision and was kind of considering Washington. And I'll be honest, Washington and Braden Platt kind of were that. It almost seemed like a square peg in a round hole. Sort of, to use the analogy of it, kind of hard to pull him away from Oregon, knowing he wanted to go run track as well. Jason Brown Jr. was another one where the staff showed interest in him, but given the logjam of running back that I mentioned, it would have been hard for them to take him and not force somebody out of the room. So I think everything that kind of happened in this class came about traditionally. I mean, UW hasn't been hot in the San Diego area, but to kind of go every now and then and get a guy out of San Diego and really kind of stretch the entire state of California to go NorCal, Southern Cal, and then even all the way down to San Diego. I think it's a good built class overall, top to bottom.
Lars, since we've come to a place in college football where the transfer portal pretty much runs hand in hand in evaluating recruiting classes, I think it may come as a surprise to a lot of college football fans from coast to coast that Will Rogers is one of the most prolific quarterbacks in the history of college football. And of course, much of that had to do with running the Mike Leach air raid system and the production that comes with that if you're a capable quarterback. I got to say that considering the contrast between a Michael Penix and a Will Rogers in terms of quarterbacking style, that I was a bit surprised. I would have never guessed that Washington would be the destination for Will Rogers. So now that we've got 5 transfer portal additions to Washington's roster, just your thoughts about Will Rogers in particular and the rest of these transfer additions.
Yeah, the thing about Will Rogers, and I was kind of because I remember when we talked about a week and a half ago that I said it would be a surprise if Will Rogers didn't end up at Washington. But the interesting part about that, I look back at his rushing stats today, and again, to your point, played in an air raid, so he wasn't asked to be a running quarterback, but he has never finished a college season with a positive rushing yardage total. Even Michael Penix, for as questionable and all the injury history and all that, he at least showed a semblance of an ability to run the ball, right? When you needed to make a play, when you needed to avoid a couple of sacks and not take those negative plays, Penix at least could do that. Austin Mack, a true freshman, has the ability to do that. But Will Rogers, I don't know if he does. So I do agree with you in that regard that I think it's an interesting destination for him. But the comp for him that I kind of have is a hybrid between Jake Haener and Luke Falk, where they both have the ability to obviously pass the ball well. And I think it's just going to come down. It's a good scheme fit because Washington loves to pass the ball. So I understand it from that perspective. But I am curious, given how much Will Rogers has checked the ball down a lot while at Mississippi State under Mike Leach, that I'm curious how much of Michael Penix's ability to throw the deep ball is going to maintain when it's now Will Rogers throwing to Jeremy Bernard. How much of it is going to be more intermediate to check down and try and go yard after the catch versus what they've had in the last 2 years under Michael Penix, where you could throw 50, 60 yards on a dime without breaking a sweat.
Absolutely. And so, Lars, in addition to Rogers, the other additions, does anybody else stand out to you? Anyone excite you that could make a meaningful impact?
So the ironic part of that, I'm going to address something I usually don't do, which is players that technically haven't signed yet. BJ Green, a transfer from Arizona State, technically has not been announced to Washington yet. I have not been given any indication that he won't end up at Washington, but I do think if they can get him in the fold, that is a massive impact player on the defensive line, where he's listed as an edge rusher, can play inside, outside. That would be one. The other one that's kind of more under the radar is Sebastian Valdez, a defensive tackle from Montana State. Somebody that they also wanted to go after was Joey Slackman from the University of Pennsylvania, who ended up at Florida. When I looked at the numbers comparing Slackman and Valdez, they're actually pretty similar. And you could make the case that depending on how much you like PFF stats, that Valdez is actually the better prospect between the two. So I think regardless, they had to get somebody on the interior defensive line position, and getting a couple of veteran bodies to replace Atuli Gasanoa and a few others. It almost is as imperative as adding a transfer quarterback in Will Rogers, because you have to, when you're going to the Big Ten, as you well know, you have to be able to you have to control the line of scrimmage. And that's something that in the Pac-12, Washington managed to do against certain teams. But even this year, we saw they got out-mauled against Arizona State, got out-owned against Stanford. There was a couple of other games where it looked pretty shaky. Now, Pac-12 championship game obviously proved the other side of that coin. But in order to do that consistently in a Big Ten conference, you have to have those bodies. And so I think BJ Green the second and Sebastian Valdez, so long as BJ obviously enrolls, which I expect he will be massive for the University of Washington next year.
Little fun fact for everyone, back to the quarterback note, is that Michael Penix and Will Rogers have the two highest career yardage total figures of any two active quarterbacks in college football. There you go. Lars Hansen, the Locked On Huskies podcast. You can join him right there. What is the best way to access that, Lars?
We are available on all podcast social media sites, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music. Just type in Locked On Huskies. Everything should pop right up. Always welcoming comments on the YouTube page. I don't know if Spotify even allows comments, but anyway you want to listen to the podcast, just search Locked On Huskies, and it should be one of the first search options there for you.
Excellent. Lars, appreciate you stopping by, breaking things down for us.
Anytime, Mark.